The railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. It was the evening of Sunday, the 29th of September, 1895. Detective Constable William Henry Osborne waited on the platform at Wigan Northwest Station. The 8 o'clock train from Manchester was due, and Osborne was expecting someone. For 2 months, the 33-year-old railway police officer had been watching the goods yard at Wigan. Night after night, a gang of thieves had targeted the wagons there, cutting through cords and sheets and making off with whatever they could carry. Osborne hadn't been able to stop them, but tonight would be different.
The murder was actually quite an important and traumatic event. He was the first police officer for the London North West Railway Company to lose his life in the execution of his duty.
This is something that affects not just the people immediately involved and their families, but the wider community. All of a sudden, you are in territory which you've never bargained for.
Osborne could hear the familiar chug of the approaching engine. He peered into the darkness. Billowing smoke and steam revealed the train coming round the bend. It was carrying another detective employed by the London and North Western Railway. With his colleagues' help, Osborne hoped his luck would change. The train jolted to a halt. Osborne raised his hand as 37-year-old Detective Sergeant Robert Kidd stepped down onto the platform. Kidd was well known on the force, an experienced police officer, a man who knew his business. Osborne smiled. Yes, he was sure. Tonight would be different. Earlier that same evening, less than half a mile from Wigan Northwest Station, 4 friends had met for a drink in the New Inn on Warrington Road. William Halliwell was 31. He was a coal miner, as were the others with him, 2 half-brothers, Elijah Winstanley and Bill Kearsley. The men's work was exhausting, filthy, and dangerous.
You're looking at very long shifts. You're looking at days that start first thing in the morning and then go on for a good 12 hours.
The inhalation of coal dust meant that by their early 20s, men's lungs were completely mottled. By the time they reached their 60s, should they reach their 60s, then their lungs were coal black.
The miners had to dig out the coal very often by hand, a lot of hard manual labour underground, a very difficult, dark, dangerous job.
The miners faced flooding. There was a danger of roofs collapsing, props breaking. So there was a tremendous amount of danger.
The mining was particularly dangerous because they're mining something called cannel coal, which is very gassy. So there's a real danger of explosions.
William Halliwell worked in one of the hundreds of pits that surrounded Wigan. It was a town transformed by the Industrial Revolution. In 1800, it had been a small market town of just 10,000 inhabitants. But by the end of the century, its population had grown fivefold. As well as collieries, there were brick factories, breweries, ironworks, and mills. Smoke choked the town's air and blackened its stones.
Within a 90-mile radius of Wigan, there were some 1,000 coal pits, and this all contributed to the wealth and expansion of the town. By 1820, the town was gaslit. It had its own public park, its own library.
Wigan is a long-established coal town. More recently, it developed into a cotton town, and then, more recently still, into a railway town.
Wigan was the place between Manchester, Liverpool. It was on a good position to act as something of a transport hub.
It's crowded, it's busy, there's a lot of speculative building, a lot of speculative enterprises going on in Wigan. It's a small-time boom town, maybe, but very definitely a boom town.
To the south of the town, in the shadow of the railway line, stood a terrace of tiny cottages, Kay's houses.
They are basically slum housing, and not that good slum housing, even so.
There would be 2 rooms up, 2 rooms down for each one, and they were actually shared typically by 2 families.
The families there are either related directly and closely by blood or by long-standing community familial feeling.
William Halliwell lived at number 6, Bill Kearsley at number 2, and Elijah Winstanley at number 22. Halliwell and his wife had 4 living children, all under the age of 10. And this was by no means unusual. Winstanley had 5 children. The older man, Kearsley, had 9. A lot of mouths to feed.
Your life could be extremely hard. Some miners lived a poor and a precarious existence with overcrowded housing, poor housing, and uncertain incomes.
The houses and their livings were all revolved around the coal mine. For the men, there was little to fall back on, and if they had no employment in the coal mine, then work elsewhere was very, very difficult.
It was hard physical work. There was always the possibility of industrial accidents or people simply injuring themselves.
In 1893, after a fall in coal prices, pit owners had demanded a 25% cut in wages. Miners across the country went on strike. At the Acton Hall colliery in Yorkshire, troops were deployed. 2 miners were shot dead. The strike was finally settled by less violent government intervention. A conciliation board was set up with representatives from both sides. Miners returned to work, initially on their old salary, before agreeing to a 10% cut in 1894.
There was a decline in demand for English coal, and in particular for the kinds of coal that were being mined in Lancashire.
The miners wanted better working conditions, better housing, better living conditions. This would have cut into the owners' profits.
So, while officially sorted, relations between mine owners and miners were not good in 1895.
For men like William Halliwell in Wigan, it was always a stretch to make ends meet. But there was usually a penny or two spare for a beer on a Sunday evening. On the 29th of September 1895, Halliwell and his friends had finished their drinks at the New Inn just after 7 in the evening. They were heading, they loudly declared, to another pub they liked, the Fox Tavern on Chapel Lane. The men walked down the Warrington Road and cut over the fields. The moon was almost full, and they could see their way clearly as they crossed the waste ground and passed under the railway. They could go straight on over another field and across a footbridge to reach the pub, but they didn't do that. To their left was the dilapidated terrace known locally as Kay's Houses. This was where they met the others. The men were not going to another pub that night. They had a different destination in mind. There were police on the railways in Britain from the very beginning. By 1826, the Stockton and Darlington Railway employed a superintendent and 4 regular officers. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which opened in 1830, had a policeman stationed at every mile along the track. But the duties of these early railway police had little to do with crime.
The early railway police have no community responsibility. They are answerable solely to the companies that set up the various forces.
The early role of the transport police was the safety of the railways. This meant policemen patrolling the tracks, making sure there are no obstructions on the track.
When railways were first established, the railway engines that pulled the trains weren't always very reliable. Sometimes the boilers blew up, the technology wasn't very good. There was no signalling system either. They had to make sure that there was no accidents and it was properly organised. So in the very early days, the railway companies employed constables for controlling the rail traffic.
Mechanical signalling and the electric telegraph put an end to that. No more would policemen be guiding trains with flags and hand signals, but there was still plenty for them to do on Britain's growing railway network. The Carriers Act of 1830 had made railway companies legally responsible for the goods they transported. Compensation had to be paid in the event of loss or theft.
From the start, the railways provided new opportunities for old style of crime.
It was all very petty stuff. It wasn't major crime that the transport police were dealing with.
The companies needed to make sure that the goods that they carried were safe because their profits depended on not losing so much in the way of goods that people would not use their services to transport their goods.
By 1850, the London and North Western Railway employed more than 700 constables on their lines. In 1863, they formed their own detective department, and 32 years later, William Henry Osborne was one of them. He'd been stationed at Holyhead and Salford after that, and in early 1895 he was sent to Wigan.
His job was really to detect offences when they happened. Sometimes it was the employees of the railway company, sometimes it was the passengers.
There were always people who wanted to cheat the railway company of their fares, travelling first class on a third class ticket, say, things like that, worried the companies.
There was an engine driver who had stolen a crate of whiskey, for instance. There was a drunken chef who'd caused troubles who had to be arrested.
He has to deal with recalcitrant passengers, with odd brawls on the railway. The most regular duty he seems to have had was trying to police the goods siding at Wigan.
These railway trucks were in the sidings, unattended, and for a number of weeks they'd been pilfering.
The railway companies were trying to do this on the cheap. It was cheaper to pay for a couple of railway detectives than to put up really secure fencing and other precautions around the goods yards.
The wagons were left overnight from Saturday until Monday morning. So Sunday was the prime time for thieving to take place in the goods yard.
Railway companies generally accepted a steady level of pilfering so long as it was small. When it became too regular and too sizable, then the complaints of customers were likely to mean that the company felt that it had to do something. And at Wigan, the level of pilfering had reached a level that was of real concern to the railway company.
On the night of the 29th of September, Osborne and a second railway detective, a sergeant named Robert Kidd, had been ordered to keep watch over the goods yard. In plain clothes, they walked south along the track from Wigan North West Station. The line was elevated above the town. Lamplighters were at their work below, tracing the streets in flame, mapping out the darkness. If he'd wanted to, Osborne could have looked to his right and picked out home, a few hundred yards away on Hodson Street. His youngest child, Elsie, had just turned 1, and his wife, Sarah, was probably rocking her to sleep. There were no gas lamps here on the railway, but the moon was bright that night. Osborne peered over the wall beside the line, down into the goods yard.
The railway sidings at Wigan were used for storing sort of goods trucks when they were being shunted and put into different trains to be taken off to Liverpool, Manchester or to the north.
The goods were covered by tarpaulins, tied down with rope or string, and so it was an easy matter to cut the cord, cut the string, roll back the tarpaulin, and then take what was available, or some of what was available, inside the wagons.
Osborne couldn't see anyone in the yard. He and Detective Sergeant Kidd continued down the track to the end of the wall. Crouching there was a man. "Hello, what do you want?" said Osborne. The man shot up. "High up, lads, have you got it?" he called, then sprang away into the yard. Osborne and Kidd rushed after him. The detectives rounded the corner. 5 or 6 other men scattered into the darkness. Kidd bolted after them as Osborne leapt onto the first man they'd seen.
He seems to have tackled the man as he tried to run away. Man who's distinctly fit, fights back, and fights back hard.
There was a lot of punching and kicking and rolling around on the ground.
Meantime, his colleague had chased after other people who were also involved in the stealing.
Osborne couldn't see what was happening, but there was obviously this fight going on.
All of a sudden, as Henry Osborne was really getting control of this man, a second man came up and kicked him in the shins, and then a third man came up and he could see a knife.
It shone like glass in the moonlight. Osborne barely had time to get to his feet. He couldn't even grab his truncheon properly. Instead, he swung it by the leather strap. It whipped through the air, smashing into the advancing man's hand. With a yelp of pain, he fell back. The 2 newcomers scattered. Osborne tried to give chase, but already limping, soon fell behind. He turned back to the first man, grappling with him once again as he tried to make his escape.
The original man had gathered strength. He actually took Osborne's truncheon from him, hit him with the truncheon and knocked him senseless.
He seems to have managed to wrench the truncheon away from Osborne and hit him over the head with it, giving him concussion and taking advantage of his dazed condition to escape.
All the thieves had escaped. Osborne limped back to the goods yard. And by the wall, he saw Detective Kidd.
It's a bright moonlight night, and it's sufficient for Osborne to see that Kidd is bleeding, and bleeding badly.
Kidd was on his hands and knees, and Osborne said that he could hear sort of blood falling. Kidd said, "Is that you, Osborne? Could you give me something to drink? I'm thirsty." Osborne could do very little to help him.
Osborne tried to lift Kidd. The injured man hung loosely from his arms. Osborne could feel the blood running out of him. He managed a few stumbling steps, maybe 10 yards at most. Then William Henry Osborne collapsed. The fight with the railway detective had left William Halliwell bruised and exhausted. He could feel his left eye swelling already, and his leg throbbed from where the policeman had hit him with the truncheon. Halliwell had been keeping watch in the goods yard, while others went to see what could be had from the wagons.
They'd actually gone into the goods yards to steal a bag of coal. But what they'd actually taken was a jar of sweets and 3 tins of condensed milk.
Very different from today, where we're used to having metal containers that are very secure. These railway trucks, they'd be very often open trucks, covered in tarpaulin or some other covering, and they'd either be roped down or even sometimes with fairly strong string.
The goods yards are very, very poorly secured. It's easy enough in the very large number of wagons to sneak up, to sneak in, to target a wagon or 2 wagons and get away with a profitable handful of goods.
Halliwell had not been on watch 15 minutes when the 2 policemen arrived. He struggled to piece together what had happened after that. He was fighting the first policeman, scrambling over the hard ground, but he had no idea what his friends had been up to until they rushed out of the darkness to join him. Halliwell knew they had to get their stories straight. He had to find the others before the police did. Luckily, he knew where he might find them. The Fox Tavern stood on the corner of Chapel Lane and Bridge Street. Halliwell stepped through the door at around 9:30. Almost an hour had passed since the fight at the goods yard, and there was Elijah Winstanley with a drink in his hand.
They discussed what had actually happened. Halliwell said that he'd been hit about the head by Osborne and he'd been punched and kicked. But Winstanley said that he'd actually stabbed Kidd several times.
Winstanley is reported to have said that he didn't think that the man he'd stabbed would survive.
That puts things on an entirely different footing for Halliwell. Halliwell has been very probably involved in pilfering before. This is the business of the magistrates' courts. And in the magistrates' courts, 4/5 of all prison sentences are for a month or less. All of a sudden, he's involved in something that is an indictable offence. And I think he starts panicking from that moment.
As Halliwell and Winstanley drank, the investigation into what had happened in the goods yard was already underway. William Henry Osborne had managed to crawl to a signal box and get help. An engine was sent down the line. They assumed there had been an accident, that the detectives had been hit by a train. It was only when they brought Kidd's body back to the station that it became clear what had happened.
The doctor was called, but it was too late. He'd lost an awful lot of blood and he'd actually died.
Part of a finger was missing. He'd been stabbed in the neck and the face and the head.
9 wounds were counted. The jugular was affected, the windpipe was affected. The identifiable deep stab wounds elsewhere to the head were an indication of a frenzied assault.
At the post-mortem, the doctor said that some of the injuries could only have been inflicted if Kidd was unconscious or had been held by somebody other than the person doing the stabbing.
Robert Kidd was the first railway policeman to be murdered on duty. The 37-year-old had been married with 7 young children. He'd been on the city force in Manchester before joining the London and North Western Railway in 1885. He was a well-liked and respected officer. Investigators had a strong suspicion where the culprits for his murder might be found.
There was no real evidence apart from what William Osborne could tell them. They really ended up going by their instincts in where the suspects were most likely to be.
The vast raid on Kay's houses was almost inevitable because so many of the men living in the houses had got convictions for stealing from the wagons.
They were simply on the balance of probabilities convinced that one or all of the culprits were going to be found in that location.
The police went from door to door. At number 2, they found Bill Kearsley in his bed. He had several cuts and scratches on his hands and face. Kearsley was well known to police. He had 2 convictions, one for stealing books, another for assaulting a gamekeeper while out night poaching. He was arrested, told to get dressed, and taken to Wigan police station.
Kearsley is an interesting character. He very clearly had, I suppose, what you could call charm. He seems to have been widely liked, and the mere fact that Kearsley is whistling, sitting on his step in his shirt sleeves and going, "I know nothing," is going to cut no ice. He is the person who they are most likely to suspect of having been involved.
They took him to the hospital where William Osborne was a patient. The doctor said he was fit enough to try and identify them, so they actually put him on an identification parade at the hospital, and he picked out Bill Kearsley as the man who'd kicked him in the shins.
When more men returned to Kay's houses throughout the night, the police were waiting for them. They arrested Richard Pritchard and a nephew of Kearsley's named David Millington. Later they caught Ralph Birchall, James Wellens, and another of Kearsley's half-brothers, James Winstanley. But there was no sign of Elijah, who lived at number 22, nor of William Halliwell from number 6. Halliwell had seen the police going house to house. He'd snuck away while he had the chance and passed the night sleeping on a barge. He waited until Tuesday when he was sure the police had left before daring to come home. But it was a ruse.
What the police did, they made a pretense of all the uniformed officers withdrawing from Kay's houses and pretended, in fact, that they had finished their inquiries. But they left a couple of officers in plain clothes behind, hiding, and then, sure enough, Halliwell reappeared a few hours later.
The fact that he'd gone home thinking he was safe, thinking he had got away with it, was something which rocked him off balance, which helps to explain the events which subsequently unfold.
Late that evening, police finally arrested Elijah Winstanley. He was taken to the Wigan infirmary, where the injured Detective Constable Osborne picked him out of a lineup. 8 men had now been arrested. On Thursday, the 3rd of October, they were brought up at the Borough Police Court. Detectives suspected that all of them had been there that night, but there was no evidence against 5, so they had to be released. Only Elijah Winstanley, Bill Kearsley, and William Halliwell were kept in custody. The 3 miners faced the charge of murder.
There is evidence to show that the pilfering expedition was on a rather grander scale than was actually proceeded with.
The police had to put a sense of priorities because it was more important to convict the murderer.
The railway company chose not to offer any evidence against another 5 or possibly 6 men who were initially suspected of involvement in the pilfering expedition on the goods siding.
But the case against Winstanley and Kearsley was only circumstantial. Nobody had witnessed what had happened behind the wagons. Nobody could say who might have wielded the knife or who might have held the policeman down. If anyone were to be convicted for the murder, police would need more evidence. So, Superintendent Robert McIntosh of the Wigan Police sat down with Halliwell. It was time the 2 of them had a little chat.
Superintendent McIntosh, who was leading the investigation, told Halliwell that if he gave evidence against Kearsley and Winstanley, that he would go free.
Halliwell, I suspect, is the one who seems the most vulnerable. McIntosh may well have said something to him along the lines of, "If you confess, my lad, it will go much easier on you."
If Halliwell refused, he could receive a long jail sentence or worse. That would be disastrous for his family. They relied on him, on his wage from the pit. Without it, they would sink into even deeper poverty. Halliwell's youngest son was not yet 1. He would not survive such hardship. Halliwell had a choice. He could save himself and his family. But that would mean sending 2 of his closest friends to the gallows. William Halliwell had been one of a gang of men. They had gone to the goods yard at Wigan on the 29th of September 1895, the night that Detective Sergeant Robert Kidd died. One of the others, Elijah Winstanley, had already confessed to the murder. At the magistrate's hearing, he'd screamed from the dock, "I did it! Kill me! Kill me!" But the 3rd man charged, Winstanley's half-brother, Bill Kearsley, still insisted on his innocence. He wasn't there when Kidd died, he said. He had run away. Only the word of his friend, William Halliwell, could contradict him.
By the time that the case is remanded to the assizes by the magistrates in the middle of October, it's fairly clear that Winstanley is understood as the killer of Robert Kidd. The question is how far William Kearsley is involved.
Halliwell's evidence was vital to the prosecution case if they were to convict Kearsley as well as Winstanley.
Halliwell had known Bill Kearsley for many years. It was a close-knit community, they lived close by. So actually it was very difficult for him. It became a matter of life or death.
The trial began in the imposing setting of St George's Hall, Liverpool, on the 26th of November. Kearsley and Winstanley were tried for the murder of Detective Sergeant Kidd. Halliwell faced the lesser charge of causing grievous bodily harm to Detective Constable Osborne.
It was already public knowledge from the newspapers that he in turn informant against Kearsley and Winstanley, obviously to save his life.
I think from the time that he had met Winstanley in the Fox Inn, Halliwell was on edge, upset.
The newspaper report sort of says that actually he was a bit of a shadow of the man he had been a few weeks beforehand because of the stress of the trial.
He knows that the evidence he is going to give linking Kearsley and Winstanley to the murder of Robert Kidd is likely to send one, if not both men, to the gallows.
The stress of it all had taken its toll on Halliwell. He looked ill as he entered the box. He gave his version of what happened that night in the yard. He told the court that both Winstanley and Kearsley had been with him in the Fox Tavern afterwards. That Winstanley had said he stabbed Robert Kidd, and that Bill Kearsley had held the policeman down while he did it. As soon as Halliwell spoke those words, he crashed unconscious out of the witness box. Halliwell was removed from court, and when he'd recovered, he returned to the witness box. He was asked to repeat what he'd said. Halliwell did so in a whimper, then leaned his head on the edge of the witness box and cried.
There was little or no other evidence against Kearsley other than Halliwell's evidence.
It is actually the thing that convinces me that he was accurate, that in some way Kearsley was actually involved in the attack on Kidd.
Halliwell seems to have been beefing up the evidence against Kearsley by saying that he was present in the pub when Winstanley admitted stabbing Robert Kidd several times. According to the landlord of the pub, Winstanley and Halliwell were in the pub on their own. Kearsley, there is evidence to show that he was actually at home, where he was actually seen by one of the policemen carrying out the investigation.
It seems fairly clear that the extent of the injuries is most reasonably, most logically explained by somebody else being involved and in some way holding Kidd down. But to do that, to betray your friend, your close colleague, your worker, is not going to have been easy.
The defense called no witnesses. By the afternoon, the judge was already summing up the case and asking the jurors for their verdict. Without even leaving their seats, the 12 men came to a decision. Elijah Winstanley and Bill Kearsley were guilty. They were sentenced to death. The following day, the charge against Halliwell was dismissed. He was free to go. Halliwell could return to his family in Wigan. The others, it seemed, faced certain execution. But then began an extraordinary campaign to save the life of Bill Kearsley.
The petition in favour of Kearsley being given a pardon was prompted when Winstanley burst out and told the court that he alone was guilty of the murder, that Kearsley was not present. The jury said that had they had that evidence, they would not have convicted Kearsley of the murder.
There was a lot of local community feeling that perhaps Bill Kearsley certainly wasn't as guilty as Elijah Winstanley, and so there was a lot of sympathy for his position.
Petitions after convictions at the assizes were by this time commonplace. It's very difficult to find a murder conviction where there is not at least one petition.
There was no court of criminal appeal, so nothing could be done about the conviction. It was only the Home Secretary who could do anything about that.
On the 10th of December, the Home Secretary made his decision. There was no reprieve for Elijah Winstanley. The 29-year-old was hanged at Liverpool's Walton Prison on the 17th of December 1895. He left behind a wife and 5 young children. But his half-brother was spared. Bill Kearsley's sentence was commuted to hard labour. He was released from Dartmoor Prison in 1903. He returned home to Wigan and found employment at a steelworks.
Kearsley returns to his community, but interestingly, he returns a changed man. He has reformed and become a teetotaler. So when his erstwhile friends offer to buy him drinks, one of the most striking things about his return is that he says no.
In Kearsley's case, there was a great sense of feeling among the public that he had been unjustly convicted of the murder of Robert Kidd. And so there was a lot of sympathy for his situation, especially as Winstanley had stressed all along that only he was involved in the murder.
In the years after the murder, Detective Constable William Henry Osborne left the railway police, but not the railways. He became a fireman and remained one until his retirement. He died in 1928. William Halliwell remained a coal miner, though he moved away from Kay's houses and the community there. His decision to turn Queen's evidence may have saved his family from the workhouse, but times were still hard. A few weeks after Winstanley's execution, pit owners demanded another 10% cut in miners' wages. The Conciliation Board, set up after the 1893 strike, collapsed. For men like Halliwell and their families, life became even more precarious. At the dawn of the 20th century, the fight over conditions and wages for men working underground had only just begun.